Clara always liked the quiet of the woods. The trees stood tall like old friends, and the air carried a freshness she could not find anywhere else. Working long hours at the small town diner was tiring, and whenever she got a little time for herself, she would take a long walk on the forest path near her cabin. It was her way of breathing again, of forgetting all the noise of the world. That afternoon, she had set out on her usual trail, not expecting anything unusual to happen. The sun was slipping slowly through the branches, painting golden lines on the ground, and the sound of birds filled the air. She was lost in thought when she heard something strange. It was not the sound of animals. It was different. A faint groan, weak and broken, reached her ears. At first, she froze, thinking maybe it was her imagination. But then she heard it again, soft but real. Her heart skipped. She looked around, trying to follow the sound, her feet crunching against the leaves as she moved cautiously. The forest, which had always felt safe and calm, suddenly seemed mysterious. She pushed through the brush, following the noise, until her eyes fell on something that made her gasp. There, lying near a fallen tree, was a man. His clothes were dusty, his boots worn, and his face carried a shadow of pain. He was dressed like a cowboy, the kind Clara had only seen in town when ranch hands came by for supplies. His hat was lying a few feet away, and his shirt was torn near the shoulder where blood had dried. His chest moved slowly, showing he was still breathing, but every breath looked heavy. Clara stood still for a moment, unsure what to do. She was alone, far from town, and here was a stranger who looked badly hurt. But something inside her would not allow her to walk away. She knelt beside him carefully. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked softly, her voice steady though her hands trembled. The man's eyelids fluttered, and he gave a weak nod, but no words came out. Clara felt a wave of concern. She touched his forehead, feeling the warmth of fever, and noticed sweat across his face. He needed help, real help, but there was no hospital nearby, no doctor she could call right away. Out here, it was just her and him. Her mind raced. She had learned some first aid over the years, mostly from caring for her late father when he had fallen sick. She could clean wounds, lower fevers, and make a person comfortable. Maybe that would be enough until he gained strength. She had no idea who he was, but she could not let him lie here in the woods alone. Clara looked around and spotted his horse tied to a tree nearby, restless and stamping the ground. It seemed the animal had stayed close to him, waiting. She whispered gently to calm the horse before turning back to the man. "I'll get you out of here," she promised, though she wasn't sure how she would manage it. With all the strength she had, Clara helped him sit up slowly, his weight heavy against her small frame. He groaned again but tried to move his legs. She encouraged him with a calm voice, urging him to lean on her. Step by step, she guided him toward her cabin, which thankfully was not too far. It felt like the longest walk of her life. The man leaned against her, his body trembling from weakness, but he kept moving with her support. By the time they reached her cabin, Clara's arms and back ached, but she didn't stop. She opened the door, led him inside, and gently lowered him onto her couch. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but it was warm and safe. She quickly fetched a bowl of water, cloth, and her small box of medicines. When she returned, she found him half conscious, eyes opening and closing as if he were fighting to stay awake. "Don't sleep yet," she urged softly, dipping the cloth into the cool water and pressing it against his forehead. "You'll be all right. I'll take care of you." The man murmured something, a name maybe. Clara leaned closer and caught it. "Daniel." She repeated it quietly, "Daniel. That's your name." His lips moved in a faint yes before his eyes closed again. Clara cleaned the wound on his shoulder as carefully as she could. It was not deep enough to be deadly, but it was painful and swollen. She wrapped it with a clean cloth, whispering reassuring words even though he was barely conscious. When she finished, she lit the fire in the hearth and prepared some warm broth, hoping he might drink a little when he woke. As night fell, Clara sat by his side, watching the rise and fall of his chest. She wondered who he really was. He looked like a cowboy, but there was something about him that felt different. Even in his weak state, his features carried a certain strength, and his hands, though rough, seemed used to more than just hard labor. But she pushed the thought away. Right now, he was just a wounded man who needed care. She checked on him again, adjusting the cloth on his forehead. For a moment, his eyes opened, and he looked at her with a faint smile, though his voice was only a whisper. "Thank you." Clara's heart softened. "Rest now," she said gently. "You'll get better." That night, sleep did not come easily to Clara. She kept listening for his breathing, making sure it stayed steady. She thought about how strange life could be, how a simple walk in the woods had brought a stranger to her door. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing: she would not abandon him. Whoever Daniel was, fate had placed him in her path, and she felt a quiet duty to see him through. And so the night passed, with the sound of the fire crackling and the quiet breath of a wounded cowboy who had unknowingly stepped into her life. Clara had no idea that the man she had carried from the woods was far more than he appeared. To her, he was just Daniel, a stranger in need. But soon, she would learn that her act of kindness had set the stage for a story that would change both of their lives forever. The next morning, Clara woke early, her body heavy with the little sleep she had managed, but her mind instantly alert. The first thing she did was glance toward the couch where Daniel lay. His breathing was steadier than the night before, though he still looked pale. The fire had dimmed, but the room carried a gentle warmth. Clara set about preparing some broth again, stirring it carefully while listening to the soft crackle of the fire. When she carried the bowl to his side, Daniel's eyes flickered open. He tried to sit up, but the pain made him wince, and Clara quickly set the bowl down to help him. "Slowly," she said, guiding him gently. "You don't need to rush." He gave her a faint nod, his lips curved in what might have been a smile of thanks. Clara lifted the spoon to his mouth, and though his pride seemed to resist at first, his hunger won, and he allowed her to feed him. With every spoonful, color returned slightly to his face. He said little, but she could tell by his eyes that he was grateful. After the meal, Clara cleaned his bandage and checked his shoulder. The wound didn't look worse, which was a relief. She worked with careful hands, speaking softly as she went, more to comfort him than because she expected an answer. He listened, his gaze sometimes fixed on her face, though he turned away when she noticed. Over the next few days, Clara made it her duty to nurse him back to health. She prepared simple meals, soups, bread, and tea, and kept his wound clean. Daniel began to talk more, though never about himself. He asked about her life instead. Clara told him about her small cabin, the diner where she worked, and how she had grown used to living alone after her father passed away. "You live out here by yourself?" Daniel asked one afternoon, his voice still rough but stronger than before. Clara nodded. "It's quiet, but I don't mind. The woods feel like home." She smiled faintly. "And besides, I've never been afraid of hard work." Daniel studied her as if her words carried more weight than she realized. He didn't press further, and Clara noticed he always avoided speaking of where he came from or how he had ended up hurt in the woods. She didn't push him. She figured if he wanted her to know, he would tell her in time. When he grew stronger, Daniel began to help in small ways around the cabin. One morning, Clara found him sitting outside on the porch, mending the strap of her old water bucket. She rushed to him, worried he was pushing himself too much, but he only gave her that calm look of his. "You shouldn't be doing that yet," she scolded gently. "I'm not the kind of man who can sit still while someone else works," he replied. His voice was firm, though his movements were slow and careful. Besides, it keeps me from feeling useless. Clara sighed but let him be. In truth, she admired the way he wanted to contribute, even when his body was not yet ready. His determination reminded her of her father, who had worked the land even on days when his strength had failed. The days passed with a rhythm. In the mornings, Clara would tend to Daniel's wound and prepare breakfast. In the afternoons, if the weather allowed, they sat outside, letting the sun warm their faces. Daniel sometimes carved small shapes into pieces of wood with a pocket knife he carried, and Clara would watch, fascinated by the way his rough hands created smooth lines. They spoke of simple things: her favorite books, his knowledge of horses, the changing colors of the leaves. Though Daniel rarely spoke of himself, Clara noticed details that didn't quite fit the image of an ordinary cowboy. His words carried an ease of education, his manners held a quiet refinement, and sometimes, when he forgot himself, he spoke with the tone of someone used to giving orders. Still, Clara didn't think much of it. To her, he was simply a man who needed care, a man she was learning to trust despite the mystery surrounding him. One evening, as the firelight flickered across the room, Daniel said something that made Clara pause. "Not many people would have done what you did," he told her. "What do you mean?" she asked, puzzled. "You found a stranger in the woods. You could have walked away. Or you could have gone to town and left me there. But you didn't. You carried me here, cared for me like you knew me all your life. That takes more kindness than most people have." Clara felt her cheeks warm at his words. She shrugged, trying to downplay it. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Daniel said firmly, his eyes meeting hers. "Not anyone." The sincerity in his voice made Clara's heart skip. She quickly turned back to the fire, pretending to be busy with the kettle, but his words stayed with her long after. Over time, Clara found herself enjoying Daniel's company more than she expected. She liked the way he listened, really listened, when she spoke. She liked his dry humor that appeared at unexpected moments. Once, when she burned a loaf of bread, he had grinned and said, "Looks like you invented a new kind of brick," and she couldn't help laughing, even though she tried to stay serious. Despite the growing bond between them, Clara reminded herself that Daniel was only passing through. Once he was healed, he would leave, and life would return to its quiet rhythm. She told herself not to get attached, yet she found it difficult. Every day he stayed, every word they shared, every glance that lingered longer than it should, made her wonder what it would feel like if he didn't leave. Daniel, too, seemed caught between gratitude and something deeper. Sometimes Clara caught him watching her, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to memorize the sight of her. But when she noticed, he would look away and change the subject. One rainy night, as the wind howled outside, Daniel confessed something that surprised her. "When you live out of a saddle, you don't expect comfort. But here," he gestured around the small cabin, his voice quieter. "Here feels more like home than any place I've been in a long time." Clara's chest tightened at his words, but she only smiled gently. "Maybe that's because home isn't about walls or roofs. It's about feeling safe." Daniel gave her a long look then, one that made her heartbeat quicken. But he didn't say more, and she didn't ask. The days stretched into weeks, and little by little, Daniel's strength returned. He began to walk outside more, his steps still slow but steady. He fed Clara's chickens, chopped small piles of wood, and even fixed the loose hinge on her door. Clara teased him that he was turning into her handyman, and he answered with a rare laugh that filled the cabin with warmth. Still, beneath the laughter and quiet moments, Clara sensed that Daniel carried secrets. There were times his expression grew distant, as though his mind was far away. Once, she found him holding a silver pocket watch, staring at it with a look of longing. When he noticed her, he tucked it away quickly, brushing off her curiosity. Clara let it go, though questions formed in her mind. For now, she didn't need answers. All she needed was to see him recover. She had found him broken and weak in the woods, and now he was stronger, more alive. And though she didn't admit it aloud, she felt stronger too, as if his presence had filled an emptiness she hadn't even realized was there. What neither of them knew was that their quiet days together were only the beginning. Daniel's hidden life, the truth of who he really was, waited just beyond the horizon. And when it came, it would test everything Clara thought she knew about trust, kindness, and love. But for now, in the safety of her small cabin, with the fire glowing and the rain tapping against the windows, Clara and Daniel shared a fragile peace, unaware of how quickly the world around them was about to change. The days rolled on, and with every sunrise, Daniel grew stronger. His steps became firmer, his voice steadier, and his eyes brighter. Clara watched the change with a quiet pride, though she never let him see how much it meant to her. She reminded herself again and again that he would leave soon, that he did not belong in her small world. But her heart betrayed her thoughts each time he smiled, each time he spoke her name in that calm, deep tone that seemed to carry more warmth than the fire in her hearth. One morning, Clara was surprised to find Daniel already outside, splitting a small stack of firewood. His injured shoulder was still healing, but he swung the axe with careful precision, his jaw set in concentration. She rushed toward him, her hands on her hips, half scolding and half concerned. "You should still be resting," she said firmly. Daniel looked up, a trace of amusement in his eyes. "Resting doesn't keep a cabin warm," he answered. Clara shook her head but couldn't help a smile. "You're a stubborn man. And you're too kind for your own good," he replied. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned back to the wood. The days began to carry a rhythm of shared work. Clara cooked meals, tended her small garden, and mended clothes, while Daniel helped wherever his strength allowed. He repaired the loose boards on her porch, trimmed the overgrown bushes around the cabin, and even took it upon himself to care for the chickens. Clara teased him that the hens laid more eggs when he fed them, and Daniel chuckled, admitting that animals often trusted him more than people did. Despite the simple life they lived together, a bond grew between them. It wasn't spoken out loud, but it showed in the way Daniel listened to Clara's stories with genuine interest, or the way Clara found herself laughing more in his presence than she had in years. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange, Daniel asked her, "Do you ever wish for something more than this?" Clara tilted her head, thinking carefully. "Sometimes. But then I remember how peace feels better than chaos. I've seen people chase after big things only to lose themselves. Here, I know who I am. I may not have much, but I have enough." Daniel's eyes grew distant, as though her words touched something deep within him. After a pause, he said softly, "Maybe you're richer than most people, Clara." She laughed gently. "I don't know about that. Rich isn't a word I've ever thought about for myself." Daniel smiled faintly, but Clara noticed a flicker of sadness in his eyes. She wondered what his story truly was, but she respected his silence. She had secrets of her own, after all, dreams she never spoke aloud, fears she carried quietly. Perhaps he was the same. In town, people had begun to talk. Clara didn't go often, but whenever she picked up supplies at the store, she noticed curious glances and hushed whispers. Folks had heard about the mystery cowboy staying at her cabin. Some warned her to be careful, others teased her about keeping secrets. Clara brushed it off, unwilling to let gossip decide her choices. She knew Daniel better than any rumor could. Still, the whispers reached Daniel. One evening, he asked her, "What do people in town think of me?" Clara hesitated, then said honestly, "They're curious. That's all. They don't know you like I do." "And how do you know me?" Daniel asked, his voice low, as though her answer mattered more than anything else. Clara met his eyes, steady and sure. "I know you're a man who works hard, even when you shouldn't. I know you're grateful, even when you don't say it. And I know you're someone who keeps his pain quiet but still manages to make others smile." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Clara worried she had said too much. But then he gave her a smile, small but real, and whispered, "That's more than most people ever notice." Their connection grew stronger with each passing day. Sometimes they shared laughter, like when Daniel tried to help her bake bread and ended up covering himself in flour, making her laugh until tears ran down her cheeks. Other times, they shared silence, sitting side by side without speaking, comfortable in the presence of one another. One night, the wind was fierce, rattling the windows of the cabin. Clara lit extra candles and pulled blankets close. Daniel sat across from her, sharpening his pocket knife, the blade catching the firelight. The storm outside made the cabin feel smaller, more intimate. "Do you ever miss anyone?" Clara asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. Daniel paused, staring at the knife before setting it down. "Yes," he said softly, his eyes clouded. "More than I can say." Clara wanted to ask who, but the sorrow in his voice made her stop. Instead, she said quietly, "I miss my father every day." Daniel's gaze softened. "He must have been a good man." "The best," Clara replied with a faint smile. "He taught me everything I know about strength. Not the kind that comes from muscles, but the kind that comes from never giving up." Daniel nodded slowly, as if he understood. "That's the kind of strength that matters most." In that moment, the silence between them felt heavier, charged with unspoken words neither dared to say. Clara looked away, her heart beating faster than it should, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire as though searching for answers in its flames. As the weeks went by, Clara began to realize how much Daniel had changed her days. Before, her life had been a quiet routine, filled with work and solitude. Now, there was laughter, conversation, and a sense of companionship she hadn't felt in years. She tried to convince herself it was temporary, but deep down, she feared what would happen when Daniel left. And he would leave, she knew that as surely as she knew the seasons would change. He didn't belong to her world of simple cabins and small towns. He was a man of mystery, carrying secrets he hadn't shared. Clara told herself she could handle it, that she could let him go when the time came. But every time she looked at him, every time his eyes lingered on hers just a little too long, she doubted her own strength. One morning, as she was gathering eggs from the chickens, Daniel walked up behind her and offered to carry the basket. Their hands brushed as she handed it to him, and the small touch sent a wave of warmth through her. She laughed nervously, but Daniel didn't let go of the basket right away. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, then finally released it and walked ahead without a word. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her heart racing, knowing something was changing between them. What neither of them could see was how fragile their peace truly was. For now, their days were filled with quiet joy and growing closeness, but the world outside the cabin had not forgotten Daniel. And soon, the secrets he carried would find their way to Clara's door. But in that moment, under the simple roof of her cabin and the quiet watch of the forest, Clara and Daniel lived as though they had all the time in the world. Their bond deepened in small acts of kindness, in shared laughter, and in the unspoken feelings that neither dared yet to name. The days of peace at Clara's cabin continued, but beneath the calm, change was coming. Daniel's shoulder had healed enough for him to move freely, and his strength had returned almost completely. He looked less like the fragile man Clara had carried out of the woods and more like someone who could face the world again. That should have made her happy, but instead, it filled her with a quiet sadness she tried to hide. His recovery meant he would soon leave, and though she told herself not to grow attached, her heart had betrayed her long ago. One afternoon, Clara had gone into town to pick up flour and salt. The general store was busy, and she tried to keep her visit short, but the moment she walked in, she felt eyes on her. A group of townsfolk gathered near the counter, whispering. Clara ignored them, focusing on her shopping, but as she turned to leave, Mrs. Parker, the storekeeper's wife, stopped her. "I hear you've got company out at your cabin," Mrs. Parker said with a pointed look. Clara forced a polite smile. "Just someone who needed help." "Well, folks are saying he's not just any cowboy," Mrs. Parker continued. "Strange men came through asking about him. They were dressed in fine suits, not the kind we usually see around here. Looked like they were searching for someone important." Clara's stomach tightened, though she kept her voice calm. "I don't know anything about that. He's just a man I found hurt in the woods." Mrs. Parker pursed her lips, clearly unconvinced, but Clara didn't stay to argue. She hurried home, her thoughts racing. She had always sensed that Daniel was more than he seemed, but hearing that others were searching for him made it real. She couldn't shake the unease that settled over her. When she returned to the cabin, she found Daniel outside, mending a broken fence post. He looked up when he saw her, his eyes softening. "You're back early," he said. Clara tried to smile, but her worry must have shown because his expression grew serious. "What happened?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "People in town, they said men were looking for you." "Men in suits?" "They asked about a cowboy." "I think they meant you." Daniel froze, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, he said nothing, then finally sighed, setting aside the hammer in his hand. "I knew it was only a matter of time." Clara's heart pounded. "Daniel, who are you really?" He met her eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw not just the quiet cowboy but a man carrying a burden too heavy to hide. He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "The truth is, Clara, I'm not just a ranch hand. I was born into a family with land, too much land, if you ask me. Cattle, oil, money, all of it tied to my name. My father built an empire, and when he passed, it fell on my shoulders. People see me as a millionaire, but they don't see me. They see the fortune." Clara blinked, trying to take in his words. "A millionaire?" Daniel gave a humorless smile. "That's the word they like to use. But it doesn't mean happiness. It doesn't mean freedom. It only means people try to use you, pretend to care when all they want is your money. I got tired of it, Clara. I left the suits, the big houses, all of it, just to ride again, to remember what it felt like to be a man, not a bank." Clara's breath caught. She had suspected he was hiding something, but the truth was heavier than she imagined. The man she had nursed back to health, the one who chopped her firewood and teased her about burnt bread, was not just a cowboy. He was someone the world called rich, someone far from her simple life. She looked away, her heart twisting. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel's voice softened. "Because I didn't want you to see the money before you saw me. For once, I wanted to be just Daniel. Not Daniel Hayes, heir to Hayes Ranch and a fortune I never asked for. Just a man who was hurt and found kindness in the woods." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. Clara's thoughts spun. She remembered every moment they had shared, every smile, every word. Nothing had been a lie, but still, he had hidden the truth. "Do you feel betrayed?" Daniel asked quietly, as if bracing himself for her anger. Clara met his gaze, her eyes shining with hurt and confusion. "I don't know what I feel. You should have trusted me enough to tell me. Instead, I had to hear it from whispers in town." Daniel stepped closer, his hand reaching out as though to touch her arm, but he stopped short. "Clara, the moments with you have been the most real I've had in years. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to lose that. I was afraid you'd treat me like everyone else does, as a wallet, not a person. But you saw me as a man worth saving." Clara's throat tightened. Part of her wanted to believe him, to hold on to the bond they had built. But another part whispered caution. His world was nothing like hers. How could a woman who lived in a cabin on the edge of town fit into the life of a man who owned ranches and wealth? That night, Clara sat by the fire long after Daniel had gone to bed. She stared into the flames, torn between trust and fear. Her heart remembered the man she had carried from the woods, weak and broken, the man who had smiled when she teased him and listened when she spoke. That was the Daniel she knew. But now, she had to accept that he was also someone else, someone the world would never let be simple. The next day, men did arrive at the cabin. A sleek black car pulled up the dirt road, its polished surface shining against the rough backdrop of the forest. Clara stood on the porch as two men stepped out, dressed in dark suits that looked far too sharp for the countryside. They asked for Daniel by name, their voices formal but urgent. Daniel appeared behind her, his expression unreadable. He greeted the men with a nod, his posture straight, his eyes steady. For a moment, Clara saw him not as the wounded cowboy she had found but as the man the world saw, a leader, someone accustomed to power. The men spoke quietly, updating him on matters Clara couldn't understand, but she caught enough to know they worked for him. They asked if he was ready to return. Daniel's eyes flickered toward her before he answered. "Not yet." When the men finally left, Clara turned to him. "You don't belong here, do you?" she whispered. Daniel stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Clara, I belong where I'm seen for who I am. And with you, for the first time in a long time, I've felt that." Her heart ached at his words, but doubt lingered. She wanted to believe him, but the gap between their worlds felt like a canyon too wide to cross. She turned away, not trusting herself to speak. Daniel didn't push. Instead, he quietly went about his work that day, chopping wood, mending fences, as if nothing had changed. But for Clara, everything had. She could no longer see him as just a cowboy. He was a man caught between two worlds, and now she had to decide whether she could stand by his side when the truth of his life demanded more than she had ever known. The days after Daniel's secret came to light felt different for Clara. The cabin was the same, the woods still whispered with the same wind, and the fire still warmed the same small room at night. Yet something in the air between them had shifted. Clara carried the weight of what she had learned, and Daniel carried the fear of losing the only peace he had found in years. Clara tried to busy herself with chores. She baked, tended the garden, cleaned the cabin until her hands ached. But no matter what she did, her thoughts circled back to Daniel. She remembered the way he had looked at her when he confessed the truth, the way his voice had held both fear and hope. She remembered the words of the townsfolk, the sleek black car, the men in suits who bowed their heads to him as if he were more than just a man. Daniel, for his part, did not press her. He still helped around the cabin, still joined her for meals, still carved little shapes from wood by the fire at night. But his eyes often lingered on her, filled with questions he didn't ask. He gave her space, as though waiting for her to decide whether she would let him stay or send him away. One evening, Clara finally spoke. They were sitting outside, watching the sun sink behind the trees, the sky brushed with pink and gold. The silence stretched until Clara could no longer bear it. "Daniel," she said softly, her hands folded in her lap. "Why did you come here? Why this place? Why me?" He turned his head toward her, his eyes steady. "I didn't plan it, Clara. When I left my world behind, I only wanted quiet. I wanted to ride, to breathe, to feel like myself again. The storm that night pushed me into the woods, and the fall from my horse nearly ended it all. And then, you found me." Clara swallowed, her heart beating faster. You could have gone anywhere. You could have chosen anyone to trust. Why me? Daniel's voice lowered, rich with honesty. Because you didn't see my name, my money, my past. You only saw a man who needed help. And you gave it without asking for anything in return. That kind of kindness is rare. You made me feel like I was worth saving, not because of what I own, but because of who I am. Clara looked away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She wanted to believe him, and in her heart, she already did. But the fear of what it meant to care for him weighed heavily. Your world is so different from mine, she whispered. I don't belong in it. I wouldn't know how to stand beside you when people see you as a millionaire, not as a man. Daniel leaned closer, his voice firm yet gentle. Clara, I don't want someone to stand beside my fortune. I want someone to stand beside me. And I can't think of anyone I'd rather have than you. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She felt the truth of his words, felt the sincerity in his eyes. But doubt still clung to her heart. The next day, Daniel rode into town for the first time since his accident. Clara watched from the porch as he saddled his horse, his movements strong and confident. He looked every bit the man she had imagined him to be, steady, capable, and somehow larger than life. Before he mounted, he turned to her. I'll be back, he promised. When he returned that evening, Clara saw the weight in his shoulders. People in town had recognized him. The whispers grew louder, the stares sharper. Yet Daniel walked toward her cabin as if it were the only place in the world he belonged. That night, he told her what it was like. They look at me like I'm something to own, something to use. But when I walk into this cabin, Clara, you look at me like I'm just a man. Do you know what that means to me? Clara's heart softened at his words. She reached out without thinking, her hand brushing his. It means you're home, she said quietly. Daniel's eyes glistened as he took her hand fully in his. Then let me stay home, Clara. With you. It was the first time either of them had spoken their hearts so openly, and Clara felt a rush of emotion she could no longer deny. She had tried to guard herself, to keep her heart safe, but the truth was plain, she loved him. Not the millionaire, not the heir, not the man in suits the world bowed to, but Daniel, the man she had found broken in the woods, the man who split her firewood and made her laugh when she burned the bread. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of peace. Daniel no longer hid his truth, and Clara no longer held back her heart. They worked together, lived together, and built something that felt like more than chance, it felt like destiny. Of course, challenges came. The men in suits returned, urging Daniel to step back into his world. They reminded him of responsibilities, of people depending on him, of wealth and power waiting to be claimed. Clara listened quietly as Daniel answered them with calm resolve. I'll take care of what's mine, he told them, but I won't give up what's real. And what's real is here, with Clara. The men looked uncertain, but they obeyed. For the first time in his life, Daniel was not living for the weight of his name, but for the truth of his heart. One evening, as the stars lit the sky above the quiet cabin, Daniel turned to Clara. His hand brushed against hers, and his voice was steady. Clara, you saved me when you had no reason to. You gave me a second chance at life, not as the man the world expects, but as the man I want to be. I can't promise you a simple life. But I can promise you my heart, every day, for as long as you'll have it. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks, but her smile was bright. I don't need promises of riches or a world I don't understand. I only need you, Daniel. That's enough. And in that moment, the distance between their worlds vanished. It no longer mattered that he was a millionaire or that she was a woman from a small cabin on the edge of town. What mattered was the bond they had built in kindness, trust, and love. The woods had brought them together, fate had tested them, and choice had bound them. Clara had found a wounded cowboy in the forest, unaware of who he truly was. But in healing his body, she had healed something deeper in his soul. And in return, Daniel had given her the gift of love beyond appearances, a love rooted not in wealth or power but in the simple truth of two hearts finding home in each other.